I'm Jo deRuiter with Aisling Dynamics Business Solutions, and I'm their Business Applications Practice Manager. And we are here today to talk about the 5-star GP administration presentation. Again, I'm Jo deRuiter, and a little bit about me. I've got 24 years working in Dynamics GP. 10 of those were as an end user and a GP admin. And the last 12 or 14 as a consultant working in GP. All in all, I've got 30 some odd years in accounting systems, including SAP, Oracle, and a few others. I sit on the board of advisors of the School of Accountancy at Kennesaw State University. I specialize in a number of areas of GP, including tables and data flow, project accounting, field service, fixed assets. Usually the weird modules are what I'm gravitating towards. I used to be the co-chair of the Dynamics Credentialing Council for Dynamics Community, and I love the Dynamics GP world. I want to thank DynamicsCon for having me on, and I want to thank you guys for voting this session in. I'm really excited to give it. I love giving this session and imparting my knowledge. Don't forget, as we begin, chat out your questions in the chat queues so that when the presentation's over with, I can answer those questions for you guys. The minute a question occurs to you, go ahead and chat it out. Don't wait till the end of the presentation. All right, so here we go. What is a GP system administrator? Well, system administrators have a lot of functions, including maintaining the GP network infrastructure. And we're going to go through all of this in detail in just a few minutes. The GP infrastructure, the Sql Server install and configurations, maintenance, performance, all of that stuff lies in your purview. GP users, including Active Directory users for Dynamic GP, GP security, GP setups. It goes on and on. You're going to be troubleshooting GP issues. My favorite, liaising between accounting and IT, the battle. And knowing when to call in a partner for assistance. That is your main roles. So let's go on and start talking about compatibility. So one of your main jobs as a GP administrator, I know, is installs and configurations. Well, the installation and maintenance of GP, a lot of it depends on the compatibility between at least 3 things. Your SQL Server version, your virtual environments or local computers or terminal servers, and the GP version. All of them working together, but they have to remain compatible. I've included in the deck here a link to Microsoft Docs on compatibility for GP 2018. A lot of things to watch out for that you have to be careful for, and that is what profile are you going to be using? Too much, and you've got too much system for the buck. And too little, and you're all of a sudden freezing, locking up, you don't have enough. So be careful when you're looking out for those profiles, which we may go over again in just a little bit. And then there's the network infrastructure, ports, installation media, organization of how GP runs. You're keeping track of your ISVs, your customizations. You're making sure everybody's installs are 100% aligned with each other. The GP infrastructure also involves making sure that the correct ports are using, the security around it all, which we are going to talk about in just a few minutes as well. So let's talk about your GP installs. Here's the first tip of the day. Organize your installation media, which means keep in a shared location your GP installation media. My favorite one was where somebody had numbered the install media in order of installation. So you want to have GP, you want to have your service packs, keeping the latest service pack kind of on top so you don't get confused about what the service pack should be. All of your ISV install media should be there as well, so no one has to go looking for the install media if they have a new install to do. The other important thing to keep are installation notes. So if you know that you have to point at a certain location during the install that's customized for your organization, or you want to keep track of the selections you made in the GP installs. As we know, when you install GP, you have a ton of different actual internal to GP products to install. Do you want to install fixed assets, analytical accounting? The installations should be uniform from one computer to the next. And therefore, keeping track of exactly what you need to install there locally in notes is very important. The one thing I recommend you don't keep in the notes are your registration keys. I know it's easy, but anybody could get hold of those registration keys. So again, focus on compatibility in your installs, and your ISV installations also have to be compatible with GP, SQL, and the version of Windows you own. So there's a lot of compatibility that you really have to focus on, and any lack in there is going to cause issues for you. Sometimes not. Okay, so let's move on and let's talk about your GP network maintenance. So we just went through the fact that you're maintaining this infrastructure. GP is a resource-heavy application and relies on both communication with SQL and on the performance of the Windows server it's installed on. This means you have to also maintain the firewalls and the antiviruses, the malware, and things like that. One of the most important things that you'll have to remember is to make sure that your GP code folder is not being scanned by any of these antiviruses. In my presentation, I've included a link to a Word document. This Word document gives you optimizations on how to maintain your firewalls, outbound ports, and the types of files that you should set to make sure they are not getting scanned. These should be the exclusions in your malware or antivirus. That's because if you're scanning one of these when somebody in GP is trying to use it, it's going to feel like GP is freezing up to the user, or it's going to cause GP to actually freeze up, which we all know can cause pretty significant data issues if it occurs at the wrong time. Okay. Again, chat out any questions, and be sure you download this when you get to the YouTube video when it's loaded up so that you can get to these documents. Okay, let's talk about SQL Server installs that you're maintaining. When you install it, if you want to do a named instance, that's up to you. Frankly, I never liked named instances unless there was a reason for them, like I was having more than one version on the same SQL server, more than one instance, etc. When you install SQL, it has GP specific needs. This is because GP didn't start out as a SQL product. It started out ages ago in the 80s, and it went through a lot of iterations and then became a SQL product, and therefore you cannot treat Dynamics GP databases like every other SQL database, unfortunately. So when you install it, there are some requirements for the installation. Binary sort order 50 or dictionary order, case insensitive, standard, I know, but mixed mode is required. And data directories are an internal decision, but the best practice is to make sure your logs and your backups and your data files are going to different drives on the same server. And let's not forget, make sure you're keeping backups external to your organization for disaster recovery in the event of a ransomware attack or what have you. Make sure you're keeping nightly backups external to your organization. When you install I always recommend installing a number of things along with it, but SQL Server Reporting Services is one you should definitely always install during the SQL installs. That's because Dynamics GP comes with out-of-the-box free SSRS reports that can replicate all of the reports that are in Dynamics GP. And what does this mean for your organization? If you have users that are going into GP just to run reports or look at data, then that's better served not using one of the extremely expensive GP licenses. You should take these SSRS reports using Active Directory and SQL permissions and give these users external access to the GP data using SSRS. There are some other reporting tools like that, including Excel, but that's not for today's presentation. Let's talk about database maintenance. SQL maintenance of GP databases is different than SQL maintenance on every other database. One, you never want to shrink them, ever. I have attached a standard GP maintenance plan here, which we're going to go through in a second. But at the very least, ensure you're grabbing full backups with recovery model full. The DynSA should always be the owner of every GP database, and there is actually some scripts you can run in the event that you're having issues to make the DynSA the owner. And change tracking on newer versions of GP, and we're talking about since 2013, should be all set to true. SQL Server itself, you want to improve performance by modifying, if needed, how much server memory SQL Server is allowed to take up, how much Windows Server memory it's allowed to take up. That's because you don't want SQL Server eating up all of the resources on the Windows Server, because that can cause almost as much slowness as not having enough memory, period. There are third-party tools you can get to monitor your SQL performance. I did not include any of those here today, but I do recommend GP admins have those tools available to them. So let's just take a quick look at the SQL Server maintenance plan. One, I've given you step-by-step instructions, but you always want to check the database integrity, rebuild the indexes, update statistics, set your database backups, delete old database backups. Believe it or not, with GP, you maybe only need the last 1 or 2 days. If you want to keep like a Friday backup for a week or two, that's fine. Just know that every transaction entered since that backup is going to be just gone, so it's going to be up to you. If you're concerned, I would recommend archiving companies instead of keeping old backups. As we all know, the old backups can eat up a lot of memory on the server. Anyway, the step-by-step instructions are going to be here for you. That's the recommended SQL Server maintenance plan per Microsoft. If you want to add anything, that's fine. Just don't ever shrink those databases. Okay. GP maintenance in the user interface is an area in which there's tons of questions and little real information. So let's talk about GP utilities. If you're on any of the modules in GP, financial, inventory, purchasing, sales, they all have the utilities box for you. These utility box have reconciles, remove history, and every now and then combiners and modifiers. Some combiners and modifiers are in PSTL, some are under cards, it just depends. I've included them here under GP utilities, though they don't always show up in the utilities box. So reconciles, what exactly do these reconciles do? Unlike check links, they're not changing your data. What they're doing is they're retotaling up all of the activity, the actual activity in the raw tables, and putting those into and re-adding them up, retotaling them, and updating the summary tables from which all of the reports are run, all of the inquiries are run. Most of the smart lists come off the summary tables. And for multiple reasons, these actual transaction tables and the summary tables get out of sync with each other. These can be caused by a number of things. Having to do data repair will cause them to get out of sync. Did you have to go in and delete transactions? Is somebody manually adding transactions through a direct table write import? Not recommended, by the way. Always use eConnect if you can, some version of eConnect. Well, if they're out of sync, these reconciles will retotal them up and fix them. They haven't changed any data, unlike check links, which we're going to talk about in a second. Remove history under utilities has its place, but you want to be careful about running it, and you definitely want to talk to a partner and do it in test before you do it in a live organization. Combiners and modifiers, I'm all for those. They are fantastic tools, but make sure you get a backup before you run those. Routines, I want you to explore the routines in detail, because at least yearly, sometimes monthly, these routines have to be run. And as a GP admin, those are where a lot of your users are going to run into problems, is figuring out what these routines are doing, or they had issues with the routine. So running depreciation and fixed assets is a routine, along with closing the year in Dynamics General Ledger. Setups, configurations are more important than many GP admins realize. The proper configurations can change the end user's life for the better. So if you have a user who's constantly saying or says something like, I don't want to keep choosing the checkbook when I'm creating a payables batch, there's a simple fix. In payables setup, you can choose a default checkbook. It doesn't lock that checkbook in, so they can choose another checkbook during batch creation. But a lot of defaults that can make your users' lives easier are here in the setups. Sales order processing is another great configuration that can make a big difference. So if you've got an end user and they never enter orders and quotes, they just enter invoices, but every time they open the window, they have to change the drop down to invoices. That's a simple configuration under user preferences. If you've got a user who never enters invoices and only enters orders, that too can be altered in the same place to where they open the window and they don't have to use the drop down. And as an ex-end user, I can tell you that the fewer clicks you have to do when entering transactions, the better. Now let's talk about check links. Check links used to be recommended to be run once a month, once a year at least, and it still has its place. It's needed. What check links does, though, is a lot more intense than what the reconciles do. Check links, let's take a payables transaction because it's easy. One with no tax on it. And no discounts. It's going to exist in at least 3 tables. It's going to exist in the PM00400 table. That's the key table. Every transaction type except General Ledger has a key table where every one of the transactions is kept and listed. Payments, invoices, credit memos, everything. That's the table that it scans through to make sure you're not duplicating transactions. It's also going to exist in the work header table and the work distribution table for payables. If you run check links and it comes across a situation where it exists in the key tables but doesn't exist in the transaction tables, it'll try to recreate that transaction in transaction tables. If it runs across an issue where it exists in the transaction tables but not the key table, it will insert it in the key table. If you do a lot of data repair and you didn't scrub all of the tables when you were wiping out a transaction, check links will recreate those transactions and you're back at square one. So be very careful when running check links. It may do things you don't want it to do. I always recommend refreshing a test company, run check links there, see if it's going to do something you don't want it to do, and then determine whether you want to run it in live or whether you need to go through a more in-depth solution to your issue. Okay. It is widely considered data repair and it can repair it. Let me be clear. Just make sure you get a good backup before you run it and understand that if a transaction's wiped wrong, it's going to reappear. Or it will remove transactions that you didn't want to disappear. Okay, next on the list is GP users and GP security. GP users can be, there's a myth that you have to log into GP as the SA, right? That is untrue. To create a GP user, your user ID has to be a system admin in SQL. I am a proponent that no one should ever be using an SA login to GP or to SQL. And that is for security and auditing. So if I enter my name as deRuiter, I set in GP, I set up that user. I then go to SQL and make deRuiter the user a system admin. That way, when I log into GP, I can create users, but my name is always associated with who created that user. In GP, anything I do, most of the time, has my name attached to it. In SQL, if I log in to do SQL work and I log in as the SA and 6 other people have the SA password, how are we going to prove what I did versus what they did in the event someone messes up? So use named users only. Don't use the SA. Do this as often as possible. But if you set up your user ID as a system admin in SQL, you can create GP users. Guard that SA password. Let's move on down to security in GP. Security in GP is granted, and it's not out of the box. You can't just set up a user and boom, they have access. You have to plan out roles and plan out who does what and who has access. So when you set up a new user, you have to assign them to a company, give them access to a company, and then you have to go down and tell GP and security setup exactly what this person's going to do. Now, if power user is not the answer ever, if you're having issues determining what security to give a user, David Musgrave has a product that will profile that security. Simply have the user sit there and click on and do their job after you turn this on, and it will create a role specific to that user, which then every now and then, if they need additional, you can give them those additional using the same product. I'm not endorsing this product. I'm just saying it's there. To do it manually can also be done, determining what they do. But too much security is a bad thing. Too little security is even worse. So that takes some planning. As a result, I've attached Microsoft's old planning tool here for you guys. It is old, but it's still relevant in many ways. You can go through that, and that might help you plan out your security for your users a little bit better. But if you're a GP admin and you have a lot of users using Power User, optimizing your security should be the next big project. Okay. We talked a little bit about configurations, but let's talk about setting up new companies. Here's the task. The accounting director comes to you and says, we need to set up a new GP company. It's a new franchise or a new store, however you're doing it. But you need to all of a sudden quickly set up a new company that's identical in setup, but different in chart of accounts to the existing company. I have my favorite tool, which is the import setup tables. However, there is a PSTL tool that's called Copy Company. Be aware, it may also copy over, it's going to copy the setups, but it may also copy over vendors, customers, etc. So be careful with that pistol tool. Importing setup tables is how I do it. I'm not going to demo that here, but in SQL, if you right-click the new company, let me caveat, all new companies have to be created with GP utilities. But after you create it with GP utilities, right-click that company, go down to import and export, click import, put in the source company you're copying from to the company you're copying to. And then the next one is choosing which tables you want to copy over. And there are a list of setup tables in a number of places. You can Google GP setup tables and you simply copy over the setup tables. And then you can integrate in the vendors and customers. Now, I have been known to also integrate in the chart of accounts and then run scripts in the GL00100 and GL00105 and MC tables if you have to change a segment in those. And that actually works if you do it that way, because the account index will remain the same if you've set up vendors with account numbers, etc. So that's a little trick that I use to quickly set up new companies. But look into the PSTL. What you don't want to do is create a new company and then manually go into it and try to eyeball one company and set it up like the other company. That's going to take forever. Okay. GP modifications in the user interface. Well, one, modifications happen to reports constantly. The Dynamics, let's talk about report modifications for a second first. One, if a user modifies a report and you haven't set the dynamic set file so that all of the installs of GP are looking at the same modified forms and reports, then their changes can't be seen by anybody else. Consequently, if you make a new install and don't manually update the dynamic set file, or at least depending on how you installed it, ensure that it's set to go look at the shared forms and reports, then the new user won't be able to see any modifications anyone else did. So make sure your report modifications are all using in the dynamic set file the same modified forms and reports path. You need to really get to know your dynamic set file, what's installed, what's used, where forms and reports are going. Your ISVs can be a modification. Professional services tools library, system and smart list preferences, all of these things, including implementing workflows, etc. These have to be done by you. Unfortunately, when you want to set up emailing in GP, those are configurations that you have to fully understand. And there's literally steps and prerequisites to each of these. I can't set up workflows without setting up email necessarily. As with anything in GP, almost everything is necessarily, or most of the time, right? And keep track of your integrations to GP. If it were me, I would document all of these, where they are, why they're there, how you did something, how it should be done. So keep track of any modifications, and we're not talking about the small ones. We're talking about significant ones, so that if a user says, oh, I'm missing this smart list, you will kind of know it's one of your customized smart lists made with Smart List Builder, which would then point you to the fact that probably Smart List Builder hasn't been installed on their machine. Okay. GP troubleshooting and issue resolution is also in your purview. When you're doing GP troubleshooting, your best bet is to whittle it down. For my own customers, when they submit a ticket, they get an instant email back asking them a few things, which will help me hone in on the problem immediately. One, is it happening for all users or just you? Two, is it happening for you on every workstation? Three, is the same thing happening on the server? That's going to help you figure out, is the issue a local issue to the user or to that particular workstation? Is it a company-wide issue? Start wide and then whittle the issues down. Also, as a GP admin, you should ask any users turning in support issues to provide you with screenshots, because when you go to Google, and Google is your best friend, when you go to Google these issues, you have to use the exact error message in order to get the best resolution. Exact, word for word, punctuation for punctuation. And it should whittle down the billions of registries on Google to almost exactly what you need to look at to resolve the situation. If a user calls you and says, my GP hung up, or they killed it because it hung up, one, change their security on that machine so they can't kill programs. Because if you kill GP while it's processing a transaction, you're looking at significant data loss every now and then. Not always, but it's going to cause headaches for everyone, including stuck batches, this and that. Don't let people kill transactions at all, unless it's been going for more than an hour or two, at which point you might not have any choice but to kill the transaction. I would look at the GP process monitor first. In Dynamics GP, the drop down that says Microsoft Dynamics GP, use the drop down, go down to process monitor, see what the status is of the process. And that's all of my tips for GP troubleshooting, except when it comes to data repair, which is a completely different topic and presentation. Now for the fun part, liaising between accounting and IT. If you're a GP admin, you've been at it for a while, you have seen the battle that rages between IT, who wants to lock everything down, and accounting, who needs things done and products installed and this and that. One, you have to train your accounting team. It's a top priority. Most support calls to you and to IT are because users aren't trained in how to log into the computer. The difference between the log into the computer and the log into GP. That honestly has been a big issue at a few of my clients. You have to understand the needs of both accounting and IT so that you, as the liaison, can communicate effectively between the two. Otherwise, you're going to have accounting ticked off because they simply don't understand why they can't do something. Or you're going to have IT ticked off because IT doesn't understand why accounting would need this. Again, be able to communicate with both teams effectively. Now for the fun part. I hope you've chatted out some of your questions. And if you take your phones and scan this QR code, it's going to take you to a cute little word cloud, and we'll be able to see it filling in later on in the YouTube video after it's uploaded. I want to thank you all for attending, and I am ready to take any questions. Hey everyone, just let me know if you have any questions. I'm here for the live Q&A. We do have a couple of questions out here. Do any of you experience GP not shutting down? That's in the general chat. So if you're a GP admin and you can help Janice, let her know. I am interested, the process running in the background, use your GP process monitor and see what's trying to run. Now, if GP opens up, you do have to give it a second before it will shut down because it's got to go out and do all of its connections and things like that. One thing to watch out for is in the database, like if you used to have McCorma, then initially there may be some orphaned links trying to look at a server that's no longer in use, etc. So if it's hung up really bad, then it's looping on something. GP Utilities does require the SA logon. Yeah, you have to use SA. As I was reading the rest of your question. Basically, the question is, for the rest of you not reading it maybe, does GP Utilities require the SA logon? Yes, it does. You have to log on as the system admin to do that. Any other questions? Otherwise, I'm just going to be staring at myself for the next 15 minutes or so. I hope the session was useful to some of you. GP administration work is very interesting. It's something I did for years and years. And I happen to love Dynamics GP, but it does have its, caveats. Oh, thank you, Janice. I'm glad you could make it. Thanks, Kathy. I hope it was able to help many of you. Do remember to download the slides, though, because there's a lot of links and a lot of embedded documents in there that can help you guys out. Is there a way for multiple users to administer GP web services? If they all have the exact permissions. Oop, the questions are coming fast and furious now. Yeah, for Yolanda, yes, they are going to be parking these videos out on YouTube after the conference is over. So you can go back and rewatch and replay. Denise, shrinking the databases. So earlier we were going back and forth. Shrinking the databases is not recommended. It can cause fragmentation. However, you could possibly re-index to correct the fragmentation, but it's still probably not the best idea. If you need more space on the server, I would put more space on the server before shrinking or trying to shrink the databases. And David Laster, also a great GP guy, he recommends GP admins keep a OneNote file documenting all of the components of an installation. I usually use just a text and then save it in my folder that has all of my GP install media. That's what I normally do. But I happen to love OneNote as well. So Dedra says she has users click on the X on the main GP window to shut down. Does that really end their session? It does indeed. There was one tweaky version of GP where it didn't, but if you're on GP 2015 or above, clicking the X in the upper right corner does indeed shut down their GP. It logs them out of the activity tables, etc. Is there any other way of figuring out what the permissions are for specific window and button? Specifically, I'm thinking of the new copy reports options button that was introduced in 18.3. So yes, if you go into Dynamics GP and you go to Administration tab and Tasks and drill in on the task, it will tell you the specific permissions. It's not easy to read at all, but it will. And then there is a third-party product made by David Musgrave that could help you as well. You're welcome, Kathy and Yolanda. The slides should be loaded up. I'm not certain where they're going to be. We'll have to rely on the DynamicsCon folks to tell us where that's going to be. Oh, and she did. Shauna answered that question. All PowerPoint decks will be available on DynamicsCon.com. To avoid Joe, Zubin. What? Is shrink databases to be avoided? Any other questions? You're welcome, Donna. Let's see. I think we've got, at least 15 more minutes. Oh, okay. Zubin's posting some scripts to avoid the index fragmentation after shrinking databases. So those of you that had concerns about that, make sure you follow the link that Zubin just posted. That's a great one, Zubin. I appreciate that. Some of the frequently asked questions, I'm always asked about the SQL maintenance. Theoretically, the why not shrink is a big question I get. And, but there are others, including why do you have to reindex? Why do you have to this and that? Basically, there's a history to GP getting on SQL. And so GP databases, they were kind of made to fit the data and not the data to fit the database, if that makes sense to anyone. But GP came from a DOS-based system, and then it was btrieve, and then it went through a few more iterations, and then it was a full-on SQL product. And so you do have to massage and baby the data a little bit. Any other questions around anything to do with troubleshooting? So troubleshooting is usually a big topic of conversation. Do any of you have issues finding solutions to any of your users' problems, or do you have any issues deciding when it's time to call in a partner? Anything like that? Well, I think we have all the sessions done. I'll stay here another 2 or 3 minutes, but I think we have all the questions done. I'll stay another 2 or 3 minutes. Is everyone enjoying the DynamicsCon session so far? Has anybody joined any of the watch parties? Again, I recommend you get the PowerPoint slides because all of the backup documentation is there. I myself am going to copy Zubin's links and add those to the PowerPoint for future presentations. Thank you, Zubin, very much.